It is my pleasure to welcome Brian Maddox on the webinar today. Brian, thanks for coming. I appreciate you being here.
I am happy to be here. I'm hoping that I have something useful to say. So I'm setting the bar low, and we'll hopefully move it from there.
Well, I must say, a lot of people got really excited when I started emailing about this. I think it's a topic that is often misunderstood, especially in and it's a lot of my circles. People get interested in the mixing part of it, and the audio, like kind of the consoles and the kind of the flashy parts of it. But when you kind of dig into the nitty gritty of like audio networking or some of the what we need to think about with broadcast mixing, a lot of people just don't have access to that info, that skill set. So, I mean, people were really excited about this conversation. So I'm sure there's a lot here we could talk about that'll help some people out. But first I wouldn't mind asking you to just kind of talk about how you got into audio in the first place. Like what brought you into it? What kind of excited you about audio, and like how did you kind of like first start working in the industry?
How were you foolish enough to get into this for a living, and why are you still doing it? So you can see the guitars on my wall behind me. So my story mirrors a zillion other audio people's stories, which is, I was playing music. I was interested in music. I started playing in bands, and nobody else in the band could figure out how to make the microphones work. And I had just enough of a technical brain that I was like, maybe I can figure out how to make that work. And then, sure enough, I could. And that got just at some point became just as interesting to me as the music part. Although I will say I spent the better part of my 20s mostly as a professional musician, and then gradually morphed into doing music for a living, and then spent most of my 20s and 30s mixing lots and lots of music. Worked for a local sound company, freelanced for quite a while. And right around the turn of the century, which is a funny phrase to say, I kind of morphed into doing more and more corporate audio, more and more corporate events, less and less music. And that's kind of brought me to where I am now. I actually got out of the business for a while. I was doing nothing but sound reinforcement, got out of the business for a while, went to work for a church. And then when I came back to the industry, I got invited to work with a company that was doing a very high-end webcasting. So they were working for lots of the big social media companies and doing very high-profile webcasting. So it was kind of a cross between, we're doing a broadcasting workflow, but our medium is not a traditional broadcasting delivery. It's a webcasting delivery, which it kind of foreshadowed then where we are now.
Right.
Now suddenly virtual events are what everybody is talking about. But yeah, we were doing it 6 or 7 years ago, using, various different things that weren't Zoom,
Right.
that were more popular then. And so that's kind of how I landed where I am now. And so now, most of what I'm doing is virtual events, lots and lots of crews that are spread throughout, the country, if not the world, and control systems in one place and mixing systems in another place and sources from many different places and all of those different kinds of things. But it was a pretty natural progression from good old fashioned mixing rock and roll and, James Brown shows to here.
Yeah, so a lot of the people that you work with in corporate audio came from music as well, you find?
A lot, yeah, and a lot of that comes from it. Certainly with sound reinforcement, a lot of the basic skill sets are the same. You still have to fly a PA, you still have to have the audio routed properly, you still have to make clean sound come out of things. But frankly, in general, the hours are better and the money is better. And at a certain point, sometimes that gets kind of attractive and you kind of want to move in that direction. And
No doubt.
And apparently you can look like a long-haired hippie and still work in corporate audio. I know of at least one example. So there you go.
Well, especially these days, like turn on the television and you can see lawyers with beards out to here. And, I think that whole kind of aesthetic thing is out the window these days, post-COVID and, all that. But No, but I find it amazing. You know, the music industry can be really difficult to work in. I've definitely seen a lot of colleagues of mine struggle in it. I've had troubles with it before. You know, it's not always forgiving, and yeah, the hours can be brutal. But certainly, it's something that we, you know, talk about sometimes, and you know, certainly, like a lot of people look at as a viable path for, you know, switching from music to something else. You know, corporate audio
Sure.
is very attractive to a lot of people. So. Um, uh, so I am kind of, I do want to talk about the setup that you were telling me about the other day. Brian and I had this conversation. It was pretty amazing.
Mhm.
He was telling me about the show he was doing with all the audio in California, and he was in Georgia mixing it. And it's fascinating, but I want to get to that in a bit. But I don't know if you want to, if you wouldn't mind talking about some just kind of audio networking basics. This is something that I think there's a lot of confusion about, you know, AVB versus Maddie versus Dante. I know you're kind of like more of a Dante specialist than anything else, but would you mind like kind of giving us a brief overview of these different audio networking protocols and what the best applications might be for them?
Sure. So yeah, and you said I'm not really. I wouldn't consider myself an audio networking expert by any stretch of the imagination. There are lots of protocols, and some of which I don't know all that well, but it all basically started back in the day with an attempt to put audio in a digital platform such that you could get it from place to place and get away from having giant copper snakes that were a pain in the butt. Um, and so kind of the first round of that were what I call point-to-point protocols. So you had things like AES 50, which was a big Midas protocol, still is, that was essentially designed to be a snake replacement. It was, you know, a point to point, this box connects to this box, these channels go to these channels, closed system, nothing else is in there. AES 50 is a really good example of that is still, you know, widely used today. Um, but uh, you know, then we started to want to address things more in a like a natural networking way, where it's like, no, I don't want to just go from here to here, but I want to go from here to here, and also include this third piece of equipment or this fourth piece of equipment, and network channels between those things, and that got more complicated. A big early version of that was ether sound, which was a protocol that was specifically designed to do audio over Cat5 cables, but to multiple points and be networked. But it was, again, completely proprietary. You know, if you needed to split signals, you needed a dedicated ether sound switch, you needed a dedicated ether sound. Everything had to be, you know, proprietary within the system, which made it expensive. Um, so then a company called Audinate decided, how can we come up with a networking solution that uses off the shelf stuff? You've got, you know, LAN networks are becoming ubiquitous. You can get very, very high quality equipment at very inexpensive costs because, you know, economies of scale. Companies like Cisco and others are making, you know, millions of switches. Netgear making millions of switches, and so we can get those for super cheap. Can we use the same topology, the same protocol, and ship audio over it? And that's where the Dante protocol came from, and that's now become very common and very ubiquitous, and it works really well. I live most of my life in the Dante world, but one of its primary weaknesses is the same thing as its strength. It's leveraging an existing network concept that was not designed for real-time audio. A standard a standard LAN is not designed for real-time audio. It's designed for data transfer. So it's inherently designed to, I'm going to push a bunch of data at you really fast, and then if I need to, I'll pause
Mhm.
and let you catch up, and then I'll shove some more data at you, and then I'll pause. Like, it's not designed to be I'm sending you things on a regular basis and you're getting them on a regular basis. And you'll hear the concept of clocking a lot when you start talking about Dante networks, and you'll hear the concepts of latency a lot, because the Dante protocol kind of jumps through a significant number of hoops in order to keep this audio stream going in a consistent, clocked, linear, real-time way, even though the network it's really running on isn't inherently designed for that. And so then the kind of answer for that, that's another current standard, is AVB. And so AVB kind of goes back to the ether sound. And again, I'm oversimplifying all this stuff. So,
that's great. It's good, I think.
But just as an overview, but AVB kind of goes back to the ether sound concept in that, okay, we're going to stop trying to transport audio over a network that wasn't inherently designed for it, so that we can control the clocking and we can tighten up the clocking and we can get latencies lower and theoretically reliability lower. I mean, better, excuse me, not lower, higher. Because we're saying we're going to take our device and send it to our device, and we're going to know what those devices are, and we know how they're going to treat our packets. And so some of the higher end manufacturers, I know Meyer's doing it. I'm sure that I know that there are others. I'm not an expert to list them off.
Avid consoles use AVB. I know.
Yep. And so they've moved in the direction of a more closed system. The disadvantage is, again, now I need an AVB switch in order to switch my signal from here to. It's no longer a $40 item I can get from Best Buy.
Yeah.
I want to just be able to plug it in and it works. Well, no, it can be a little bit more complicated.
Right.
But that's a basic overview. I mean, Dante is very reliable. I use it all the time. And it's much less expensive overall to create a very large system, but it's a little bit of a compromise.
Are there distance problems with any of these that you know of, like running AVB more than a few hundred feet, or Maddie more than a few hundred feet?
Well, and actually Maddie is one that I skipped, so I apologize for that. Maddie is a point-to-point protocol, much like AES-50. Maddie was developed specifically in the broadcasting industry to ride on the backbone of existing video routing systems. So you could put it on a BNC cable, you could put it in a video router. The video router would just see it as digital video, like it, and you could route it from place to place in these existing, very expensive, complicated video routers that were in trucks, and spit out a bunch of channels at the other side. But again, it was still a point-to-point. These channels go to this destination, not everything goes to a hub and we can split things off however we want. A lot of the distance limitations are reflected by what the underlying structure it's built on is. So, a traditional data LAN network on a Cat5e cable or a Cat6 cable, general rule is anything past about 100 meters, anything past about 300 feet, you're starting to get into risky land as far as how well it's going to work. Now, that being said, Dante can be run over fiber because LAN networks can be run over fiber. Once you convert to fiber, all bets are off. You can go across the country, you can go wherever you want to go. Maddie's a similar thing in that, SDI signals, traditional video, digital video signals are, again, depending on the cable, depending on a lot of different variables, it's about 300 feet. And then you're starting to, you're starting to push your luck a little bit.
Right.
And then you want to get into some sort of a fiber thing. So it's a very rough rule of thumb, but in general, with almost any of these, in fact, I think AES-50 is the same way. 100 meters, 300 feet, up to that point with good wire, you can transport things over copper fairly easily. Once you get past that point, if you're starting to look at fiber or some kind of repeater system or some kind of other solution.
That's about how long our cable runs are for front of house in arenas, about 350 feet. It's kind of like what we, kind of the longest we kind of see in live music production. But yeah, I guess, you get into bigger events, trying to like run stuff all over huge, huge like festival like sites and stuff. Yeah, it's I'm sure that you have to think about that kind of stuff a lot.
Well, well, and even in a traditional like touring arena world, you can have a B stage that's out in the middle
Sure.
of the floor. You can have, front of house in a different position. You could have monitors in a different position. You could have, feeds that have to go to a record system that might be a broadcast console that's on the other side of the building.
Sure.
And that's where these networked systems like AVB, like Dante come in handy, because then it's like, okay, I'm going to ship channels 1 through 80 to front of house. I'm going to ship channels 30 through 92 to broadcast, because that's what they need. And I'm going to ship returns. You can get these very complicated routing schemes, and everything gets where it needs to go, and you're not running, again, many giant blue wires, because that's no fun at all.
So where do you see the protocols going from here on out? I mean, do you see something like along the lines of Dante, or like a beefed up Dante kind of taking over everything? I know the audio world is kind of strange with protocols. Things take a long time to develop, and there's a lot of people that have different interests in what succeeds. But
One of my favorite sayings is that the greatest thing about standards is that there's so many of them. And as I kind of explained when I was going through the different protocols, the kind of primary, I think right now, the big three are Maddie, Dante, and AVB. Those are kind of the big, there's others, and not to discount anything else, but those are kind of the big three. And all three of them exist in certain areas of the industry where they are the best solution for that application. Consequently, I don't really see any single one of those completely supplanting the others, because, there's, thousands of video trucks out there and thousands of video control systems that have, tens of millions of dollars worth of video routing gear, and Maddie just works through them very easily. Why would you change? Why would you go to something different and add a whole bunch of other infrastructure? Dante, works fantastically with existing network systems that are already there, but has some latency issues that for other applications can turn into a much bigger deal. And, at the very highest level, if I'm building a mixing console and a stage rack, I want to make absolutely certain that the signal goes where it needs to go as fast as possible, lowest possible latency, best control. I'm going to go with an AVB system that I can dictate exactly what I want it to be. So they're kind of answering three different things. Yes, there are stakeholders in all three of those as well that are pushing, their particular protocol as the answer to everything. But more importantly, I think they just answer different questions. And honestly, not to completely discount AES 50, which is a bit of a legacy protocol at this point, but it's very inexpensive. And if all I'm doing is putting an X32 and 2 stage boxes together in a club system, and distances are 100 feet away from each other, I'm just going to use AES 50. It just works. If you plug it in, it's just going to work. It'll be fine. There's no reason to get more complicated than that. And so for very much simpler systems, a system like AES 50 is the answer. So I think they're all going to continue for a while.
That makes sense. That's a great perspective on it. So, all right. So I want to get to a question that I hear all the time, and it's a large, I don't know, huge concern with a lot of people right now. How do we best send audio over Zoom? This has come up so many times. Do you know? I mean, have you? I assume you work with Zoom all the time, like trying to send audio. What's the answer?
So the answer, thankfully, changes every time Zoom updates something. Not to throw Zoom under the bus, but and kind of the best way to send audio over Zoom is almost a 3-hour webinar in and of itself. But there are a couple of settings in Zoom that you know, you have to look into turning on original sound,
Yeah.
because that eliminates a lot of the compression, it eliminates the echo cancellation. So you turn off echo cancellation, you turn off noise suppression, you turn on original sound. This is a quirk that may have been fixed. So if I'm saying this and somebody knows I'm wrong, that's fine. But particularly with the Mac Zoom client, if you are using a multi-channel audio interface, so if you're attaching to a say an XR18 or something that has more than 2 channels, the Zoom will automatically take all those channels and collapse them down to mono. So that's another little gotcha to know that if it sees an interface that's more than 2 channels, it will just collapse everything down to mono no matter what you do. There's ways around that. You can use loopback and some other tools to basically create a 2-channel interface. But Zoom wants to see a 2-channel interface. If it sees a 2-channel interface and you turn on original sound and you turn on stereo, it'll send a stereo signal of pretty decent quality. I want to say that it's 96 kilobits sampling rate, something like that. It's not amazing, but it's pretty good. Like you can get a show quality signal through Zoom if you take those steps. There's also lots of, you know, you can go online and there's YouTube tutorials and all kinds of things of where these buttons are that I'm listing off so fast and exactly how to do them. And the other thing is that it is all in, it's not like you need a special license. You don't have to pay extra for this. It's just mostly a matter of you have to click through these things. And in the case of some of these, if your preferences aren't set right, you have to click on them every time you open up a new meeting, which is a bit of a pain. But, you know, for instance, right now, I am not using original sound because my laptop fan is screaming because my laptop is 8 years old and I don't want you to have to hear that. Yeah. But yes, you can get, and I have used Zoom audio for, and I know we're going to get into it, for monitoring audio for doing remote mixing, and it works perfectly fine.
Yeah. So let's get into that setup of your show from California to Georgia.
Sure.
Yeah, like how. First of all, I guess just maybe tell us about what you're mixing, what the event was, and how you had it all kind of wired up.
So the concept is as soon as you get away from doing sound reinforcement where you need to be in the same room so you can hear what it sounds like, as soon as you get into a more of a broadcast environment, more of a, you know, I'm mixing in a truck kind of environment, it's at some point you start to think to yourself, why do I need to be right next to this event that's happening? Why do I need to be right here? Why can't I be somewhere else? And, you know, when the pandemic hit, I started really thinking, you know, it would be way better if I could be somewhere else, and started brainstorming and looking at workflows that would make that possible. And so jumping to the end, because there's a whole bunch of development point in the middle, where I've ended up with is a concept where, in this particular case, this particular show, they've got a studio in California, which is basically just a virtual studio. It's made up of a pile of Zoom computers in a rack, just a pile of PCs. And all of those bring in Zoom callers. All of the video goes into a video switching system like a traditional broadcast switch would be. All of the audio goes into a mixing console. I create mix minuses back to everybody so that everybody can hear everyone else and not themselves, which is all a mix minus is, and create a show. And, you know, then we can, you know, at full audio quality and full video quality, control, you know, when people are on camera, when they're not on camera, when their mics are on, when their mics aren't on. So we're not relying on them on the other end to turn their camera off or turn their microphone off or anything else. We can control all that. We're using Zoom rooms with the license necessary to get 1080p video. So we get high quality video, we get high quality audio. and then I'm controlling it all from Georgia, and that's where it gets interesting. So the mixing console that I'm using in California is a Yamaha QL1, which is a very common uh, mixing console. That's fairly small. It's about a third, I guess, 48 input console if you count all the bits and pieces. And but it's part of Yamaha's line that goes all the way from a QL1, which is kind of their smallest version, through a QL5, through the CL1, all the way to the CL5. And once you get to the CL5, you're at a 90 input console with 48 outputs or something.
Yeah.
But they're all basically in the same family. They all use the same control protocol. They all use the same basic, the screens are the same. That it's a really good, Yamaha did a really good job of making a whole line of consoles that all kind of work the same. Excuse me. So what we've done, and the we in this is my good friend Andy Broughton, and I'll put a link to his website in the chat here in a minute. Excuse me. Is created a program called Remotely Possible. And what Remotely Possible does is it allows any of those Yamaha consoles to link to any other of those Yamaha consoles, even across the different products. So a CL5 can connect to a QL1 and any combination of that, and essentially let one of those consoles control one for one the other console, essentially mirroring the console. So everything I do on this console will do. And so the workflow then is I have a CL5 here in my house, just off my shoulder here, not that one, it's over there. And I connect that over the internet to the QL1 in California, and I sync those two together. It's built into the Remotely Possible software. I just basically push a sync button, and the current state of that console gets copied onto the current state of my console. And I then mix on my console a show, like as if it were being mixed on my mixer, but the audio never leaves California. The audio stays in California. It's mixed in California on that console remotely, and goes right back out of the webcast output, and everything still happens in California.
So the only audio you're getting in Georgia is like just monitoring, right? Just like making sure that you can hear what's going on. Right.
That's exactly right. And so, so yes, it's basically, I take the monitor output, 2 channels out of the QL1. I use a product called Unity Connect to ship that audio to me over the internet. But it's just stereo audio. Honestly, I could ship that to myself over a Zoom call and it would work fine, because again, I'm using it as a reference. It doesn't have to be super amazing, pristine, high fidelity audio. It just needs to be a good representation. I can hear the equalization. I can hear it's a good representation of what's going on. Now, Unity Connect is capable of full uncompressed 48K audio. So at that point, I am listening to it. I may as well be in the control room in California, like I'm listening to the exact same thing. But that's essentially the workflow. And a lot of people are doing this. But in most cases, they're using some kind of a computer to control a remote console, which is okay, but there's no substitute really for having your fingers on faders and being able to, move knobs and like having an actual piece of hardware to control. You just can't do it as fast. I don't care who tells me otherwise. You can't do it as fast on a computer interface or an iPad or whatever. Like
100%.
There's there's no substitute for having a piece of hardware.
No,
and so that's the basic workflow.
Yeah, even just trying to kind of like control monitors with an iPad, or like what some small like setups do, or yeah, anytime I'm trying to control a console away from a console, I feel like there's a thought process that has to happen. I have to figure out where something is. It's like learning a whole new thing,
Yep.
Part of our workflow in live music is just being fast hands on faders and knowing where those faders are and building that into your workflow on the console and all that.
I talk about this a lot with younger audio engineers, and really the difference between decent live sound engineer and the top flight guys that are flying in from all over is split seconds. It's, you know, 50 milliseconds of difference of reaction time. It's all about, it's not good enough that I know how to mix it and I know how to get the right sound out of it. I need to be able to get it as really fast. Sometimes the difference between it's perfect and it's just slightly off is the difference between I get called back and I don't get called back. And so then, yeah, those little differences of I can just work so much more quickly become kind of a very big deal.
Yeah. All right. So a question just came up, and of course, I know you were going to cover this anyway, but Whit asked, how is there not crazy latency with that setup with both audio and console control?
So everybody, this is the very first question everybody asks me, because it just seems like what I'm talking about is voodoo magic secret sauce and it can't possibly work. And I hear you. I mean, it doesn't seem like this could even remotely, like you're across the country, like how is this possible? So my monitoring path through Unity Connect, depending on specific day and circumstances and exactly which connections it goes through, averages between 40 and 50 milliseconds. So it happens in California. I hear it 50 milliseconds later. My control latency, which is to say the amount of time it takes for me to push a fader and the fader to move in California, is about 12 milliseconds. So those are kind of random numbers. So it's 62 milliseconds or something of latency. But if you just want to do a real quick shorthand, you can just convert that to feet. And essentially what I'm doing is exactly the same thing as if I were mixing front of house at a concert and I was 60 feet from the stage, which we do all the time and don't think twice about it. If you're 100 feet from the stage, you're mixing 100 milliseconds, I'm rounding, 100 milliseconds behind the show, because that's how long it took the audio to get to your ears before you even heard it. We do this all the time. We don't think about it. It is kind of magic that it can get across the country that fast. I don't understand how that works. I don't. I admit. But I'm here to tell you that it does, and it does consistently all the time. And I've done literally hundreds of tests, and you know, about the most audio latency that I've seen. I was in California, and I did a VPN to Hong Kong and back, and I was able to get audio from California to Hong Kong and back in about 95 milliseconds.
Wow.
Which is
really across the Pacific.
Crazy.
Yeah.
Just crazy. Just utterly. I don't even understand. I don't even understand how that works. Physics, magic, space-time continuum. I don't know, but I know it works. So yeah, you would think that this latency thing would be really a thing, or, you know, I make a change and then the change happens later. Like I make a change, you would think. The reality is that's just not been my experience. It is absolutely no different than mixing a band and bringing up the fader, and a split second later that vocal comes up, because that's how long it took the audio to get to your ear after you made the change. Like it's normal stuff.
Yeah, that's quite amazing, man. You know, of course you could extrapolate it to live music. It would be difficult to mix a band, you know, in a room across the country, but when we're talking about broadcasting, like we're going to be talking about broadcasting for everything probably for years now,
right,
from here on out. Like it's definitely pertinent. I mean, I did a live streaming gig last month, and it was really, you know, I moved the console to a completely different part of the venue, but I was still in the venue. But I was 200 feet away. There was no audience, nobody there, but I was still in the same room, and I could hear all the instruments and stuff. You know, and I was thinking, like, why am I not somewhere completely different? You know?
Yeah, and I don't mix music much anymore. You know, I pretty much do corporate stuff, but I mixed music for a long time, so I definitely understand it. I definitely understand the needs. I would not mix a band for a live audience,
right,
from another location, because there's no substitute for being in the same room and hearing the PA and hearing the interaction of the room and the stage and everything else. I'd be the first to say, no, you can't, you can't shove somebody in another room and do that. But I absolutely would mix a band for a web stream or a broadcast from across the country without the slightest hesitation. Like, there's absolutely no technical limitation that would make that be, something that you couldn't do or would be risky. And, this whole idea of we leave the audio locally and then we just remote control that console, solves a lot of these latency issues, because, as far as like you could mix monitors for a broadcast from another state. Like, why not? Because the audio staying locally, that 2 milliseconds of latency going through the console to their in-ears doesn't change. And that 50 milliseconds of latency that you're behind in your mixing cues it's just not relevant. It sounds like a forever amount of time, but the reality is it's really not. When we mixed wedges, you were automatically 10 feet away from your cue wedge. You mix side fills all the way across the stage. Like, we've dealt with these kinds of latencies organically for, certainly my whole career. So it sounds like it would be a problem. And all I can tell you is that, having done it, I very quickly, I was surprised, even though like I knew the math and I knew it should work out. I very quickly forgot that I was not mixing audio in my console in Georgia, that it was actually all staying over there and that I was in a different location. It just didn't feel any different.
Yeah. Well, that's great. I love it. So like, what's a lot of the type of content you're mixing with these corporate shows? Is it mostly people speaking? Is it a lot of playback video content, that sort of thing?
Exactly. So, I when I was still doing, in-person events, and I hope to still do in-person events in the future, hopefully soon. We all hope soon. Yeah, it's lots of, people giving speeches, lots of panels, having conversations with each other, lots of video rolls and that sort of thing. The thing that makes corporate audio interesting is not necessarily the content. And that's one of the biggest differences between doing music mixing, I think, between doing music mixing and doing corporate is, for the most part, it's not always true. Sometimes I mix things that are very compelling and interesting, but quite often the content is not very interesting, but often the technical challenges are far more interesting. If I've got 16 Zoom callers coming in and I'm creating 16 mix minuses with IFB talkback systems in a matrix comm system with producers in 17 locations in the country who want to be able to push a button and talk into that one person's ear while the other person is on air talking, and have that still work, and everybody can hear everything, and there's no delay and there's no echoes and everything works. That's challenging. Like that, there's a lot to that. And I find that very interesting. It's lots of routing and lots of kind of wrapping your head around the fact that, okay, if I send this to that location and they send it back, then there's going to be a 50 millisecond issue that I have to deal with if I blend it with something else, and there'll be an echo, and there's lots of moving parts that I think make it very interesting to do.
It's cool. All right, so Sean has a question here in regards to remote live mixing. What's your take on the Tokyo Symphony remote live mix? Have you heard it? I have not.
That is not something that I am familiar with. So my take on it is I am going to go watch it.
I will, because and Sephora asks, are you currently mixing for any houses of worship at the moment?
I am not. Well, That's not really true. So I am very heavily involved in my local church here in Savannah. Now, most of the time when I'm volunteering there, I'm volunteering on stage because I still know how to play guitar. Um, but I do mix there occasionally, and I am definitely involved in the House of Worship tech world. I write for one for Church Sound magazine and some other things. And one of the things that I am actually hoping to do with this remotely possible software is to assist. I have several friends in Georgia who are tech directors at churches who have Yamaha consoles, and to be able to easily, do training remotely where I'm on a console, they're in front of a console. I'm, moving things organically, talking about screens, talking about things. They're changing right in front of them. They're making changes and I'm seeing them, and being able to do that interactive training is something that I'm definitely hoping to do a lot more of in the future. That's, in fact, really the only thing that's holding that up is remotely possible is in what we're calling final beta. So we're right on the cusp of being able to actually release it, and that will kind of enable me to then you know dial into other people's consoles and other people's situations more easily. But I am very involved in the church tech world and the challenges thereof, and have a real passion for that that whole world. It's I, I've talked about this. I was a guest on Samantha Potter's Church Sound podcast, and I said mixing on a Sunday morning, especially in a contemporary music service, is the most challenging audio job there is. It is way easier to mix a rock band in an arena than it is to mix the same band that probably isn't as talented and doesn't sound as good, and you have to mix them at 84 dB at 7 o'clock in the morning on a Sunday. Like, that's much more difficult.
You got to make a lot of people happy.
And you got to make a lot of people happy. And most of them don't understand the difficulty of what it is that you're doing. And you don't have the ability to just, talk to the tour manager and go, okay, I can't get the sound I need. I need this $10,000 box. And then it shows up on the next, the next city. Like, it doesn't work that way.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's a lot of people that mix for houses of worship that subscribe to the Production Academy and take the courses. So you can definitely see there's a lot of need for education in that world. I've talked to a lot of people that like exist in that world, that mix in that world, and a lot of talk about the need for education there. So it's good that you're doing that, and like teaching remotely with remote consoles. That's genius, man. I love that.
Yep.
That's really cool. All right, so let's talk about broadcast mixing a little bit, and maybe just some general tips, approaches about how we can think about broadcast mixing versus just like the front of house mix, what's coming out of the console.
Okay, so there's this is again, I feel like we're like rocks skimming on the surface of a whole bunch of very deep ponds. So I'm definitely going to be skimming on the surface of very deep ponds. But the biggest challenge in moving from live sound reinforcement mixing to broadcast mixing is dynamics. And so much of that comes down to the way that our brains perceive a live event versus something on a screen. So if I go to a concert and I see a band perform, and then I see something, the lead singer talk in between songs, and then they perform again, and then they do a quiet song, and then they do a loud song, and whatever, my brain expects the dynamic range to be the same as if I were just sitting in somebody's garage and a dude was talking to me, and then they played a song, and then a dude was talking to me, and then they played a song. I expect, because it's happening live in front of me, I expect a wide dynamic range. I expect soft songs to be soft. I expect loud songs to be loud. I expect somebody talking to be a lot quieter than drums pounding away. Like there's, and so, if you've ever done, and I have, you've probably done this with Smart or other tools where you'll do a timeline of volume for a concert, and there'll be big mountains and big valleys and big mountains and that's very organic, and that makes sense. But we all watch television, and that's not how television works.
Nope.
Basically, there's an expectation of, now it's in a box and it's in front of me, and I basically expect everything to come out of that box at about the same volume. And so when you're doing broadcasting, if you're doing webcasting, which is just broadcasting over the internet, there's some differences, but it's essentially the same concept. Now I'm expecting a much, much more limited dynamic range. I'm expecting, if we mix the same dynamic range for a broadcast, basically every time the band stops playing and somebody starts talking, everyone's going to be reaching for the remote control to add 15 clicks on the remote, and then turn it back down, and then turn it back up and turn it back down, because, we expect the volumes to be the same. We're listening to a band on whatever channel, since MTV hasn't done music in 20 years, whoever it is that does music now, you're listening to a band on, watching it on television or watching it on YouTube.
Yep.
And you switch to another channel and somebody's just talking. I expect this to all be the same.
Yep.
Doing that live with a live event becomes very challenging, because now I have to significantly decrease the dynamic range that I'm working in without making everything sound squashed and gross and bad.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the big, like, overarching challenge in a nutshell. Since we mentioned churches, a lot of churches, when the pandemic hit, started streaming their services. And the probably biggest, most common mistake was essentially just taking their front of house mix and sticking it in a computer. And if they got the levels right so that the band sounded right, as soon as the pastor got up to talk or somebody got up to give announcements, they disappeared.
Yeah.
And people were like, I can't hear him talking. And then they would turn up their TV or turn up their computer to hear that. And then the band would come on and it would be distorted and loud. And that significant differential that you have to compensate for is, one of the most basic things, but it's a little unintuitive. You just kind of think, oh, I just do this and I put it in a computer and it will work. So that's fundamentally, that's one of the biggest differences, is your dynamics have to be significantly more compressed, both literally with audio compressors and also just in a smaller window. But you still have to make it sound natural, and that's a very challenging thing. Beyond that, there's lots and lots of other, perception differences. Okay, so then the other, I would say, huge difference between mixing in a live environment versus a broadcast environment is, if you mix in a live environment, in a live concert environment, you are mixing for one set of outputs. Your PA, you know what it sounds like because you're standing right in front of it, and you're making mix decisions based on, this is what is coming out of these speakers, this is what it sounds like, and I'm deciding based on this. As soon as you are in a broadcast environment, regardless of the type of broadcast environment, you're mixing for 1,000 different kinds of speakers, headphones, AirPods, who knows what.
Yeah.
And you're having to make mix decisions based on things you can't even hear. Mm-hmm. So you're having to create a mix that will translate and work. A lot of this comes from a studio environment too, that will work on the broadest number of things, rather than it will sound fantastic through this D&B rig that I have up right now. And that's also a very different environment.
Yeah, well, that's cool. I feel like, I don't know. I feel like there's just so much perception in music. It's hard to it's hard to kind of get a sense of how stuff sounds unless you're listening to it on the right stuff. I don't know. Do you have a preferred speaker that you use for like reference when you're doing broadcast stuff? I mean, is there like reference monitors? Do you use one of those like little RLX speakers?
So the answer to your question is, for most of the spoken word stuff that I do, most of that stuff, I use, I probably can't quite get it in the camera range, but good old fashioned Fostex powered speakers, which are a very, very basic little 4-inch powered, basic sounding speaker. It's very much like the little RLX little,
Yeah.
you know, extremely basic, doesn't sound particularly great. It gives me a very average-ish kind of sound.
Right.
But of course, when I'm mixing spoken word, when I'm mixing, conversations, I mostly just want it to sound like the people sound like when they're talking. I don't really want to change the sound that much. What I really want it to sound is just like them. So I'm mostly doing damage control. Does it sound buzzy? Does it sound really tinny? Does it sound, really, does the room they're in sound boomy? And so I'm making, from a tonality standpoint, very, very basic adjustments.
Do you lean heavily on effects?
I basically, I no. And in point of fact, if you're doing conversational stuff, you basically are never touching your effects rack for anything like reverbs or delays or any kind of the traditional, what we think of as music effects. However, I use dynamic EQs very heavily. I use compression very heavily. And I use auto mixing very heavily, and so that's where it's basically, do I use effects? Yes, but just completely different kinds, because dynamic EQs are again going to get me in that smaller dynamics window without completely hammering the way somebody's voice sounds. It's a great way to get rid of proximity effect. If somebody's using, say, an SM7 for their microphone and they lean into it and it gets really bassy, and they lean farther away and it gets less bassy, and it's like, I don't want to just compress the whole thing. I just want to compress some of that low end so that when they lean in, it eliminates some of that proximity effect. Those kinds of things get leveraged, very heavily. And sometimes dynamic noise reduction. The Yamahas all have the Neve 5045 plugin, which is an excellent noise reduction filter. I use the Cedar DNS systems a lot, which is another kind of magic remove background noise box. So yeah, I guess I do use a lot of effects now that I think about it. I just don't use reverb. I'm not adding room sounds typically to anything.
Yeah, those 5045s I've found to be invaluable tools for any band I'm mixing now. Always have them. They're fantastic just for cleaning up those vocals, especially if you have a loud band behind you, a lot of drummers.
Absolutely.
It's one of those little magic tools.
It's one of those little magic tools. And when it was a Yamaha firmware update that put them on the CL and QL series, and it was one of the happiest days of my life. It was like, oh, now I've got a really great tool and I've got a bunch of them. And so it's very common. I'm working on a show next week, and I'm using every instance. I've already plotted out the input list and everything. I'm using every instance in a CL5 of 5045 I can get, because it's kind of like a magic cleanup.
Yeah.
Because the other thing you have to remember is that, much like a band, even if it's a panel or spoken word or whatever, it becomes additive. So if you've got a lot of background noise, maybe for one person it's not that much of a problem, but as soon as I've got 3 or 4 people or 5 people, like in the environment that I'm working in, I've got a lot of OmniLav mics in a big giant room with some HVAC noise. It's not terrible. For just one person talking, it wouldn't even be that distracting. But as soon as I get 5 or 6 people on stage, all of that background noise starts to add up and becomes cumulative. And now it's a problem. And those 5045s do a huge work of lowering that noise floor. and lowering the noise floor before I then go and compress all the dynamic range and bring it back up again, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, no, actually, dynamic EQ I found to be invaluable for music mixing. Again, on vocals, putting stuff out in the front of the mix, keeping some stuff from popping out. I don't know. It's just kind of like a little magic thing, you know. It cleans it up, brings it out.
They're kind of magic. 100 years ago, Brooks Sirens had the 901. I think I'm getting that right, which was an analog version of the same thing. And once I discovered that, I was just like, okay, now my rack, I'm going to need 16 of these at all times, because there's always going to be I'm never going to want a regular compressor ever again, because I want to be able to just some sibilance, get rid of that.
Totally.
Oh, there's some honk, get rid of that.
Totally. It's amazing, you know, to have all the access to the plugins these days, and just, you know, be able to pop something in if you need it, and not have to go just run back and be patching analog cables and like and hurrying, and you know, all that stuff. Digital technology is amazing. So one question that has come up, I don't know, I've heard this a lot, and, apart from this too, but any targets for a loudness unit full scale?
Yeah, so that's
concerts.
So that's a great that's another great topic. And so when so there's two basic situations when you're doing broadcasting that you're dealing with, and especially if you're doing webcasting, this is where this really comes into play. The first one is that the encoder, the actual thing that's going to convert this thing and send it out to the web, is right next to you in the same room. So you're sending your signal straight from your mixing console, straight to embed into a video, straight into a box. So it's a known signal chain, and you know what you're getting into. And in that situation, I want it as hot as I can get it, as close to zero as I can get away with, because I know there's no clipping point between me and the box, because I'm sitting right next to it. So there's no place that this is going to get boosted and create a problem farther down the line. And so in that case, you know, in dB, you know, my targets can be minus 0.5. My LUFS level minus 12. Like, I mean, kind of is how hot can I get this? How much audio can I cram into this? Because a lot of people are going to be watching this on an iPhone, and I'm competing with a pre-processed, compressed YouTube video, and a pre-processed and compressed TikTok, and you know, all this other stuff. As soon as I'm not right next to the delivery mechanism, the rules change, because I have to leave some headroom for the things that may be in between me and the final product. You know, and that's where minus 18, you see here, that one is a number a lot. That's where that comes into play as a, you know, kind of a standard LUFS number. I mean, the other thing that I do with, with LUFS, and somebody actually says, talk about LUFS, and we keep saying LUFS, like everybody knows what that is. Why don't you explain to us what LUFS is? And if you don't, then I will.
Please go ahead. I mean,
okay.
Yeah.
Excuse me. Sorry, I'm talking so loud that it's choking me up. I can talk quieter. You can still hear me. Again, skimming the surface, but LUFS is a relatively new loudness measuring system that kind of takes the overall signal as a whole and creates a measurement number off of it. So it's, you know, how much low end is there? What's the average signal peaks? Where are the peaks? Where are the valleys? And kind of takes all of that stuff, encapsulates it into one magic number, and then delivers that as, you know, your signal is at minus 18 LUFS, or your signal is at minus 24 LUFS. It's really great, because before we were kind of dealing with peaks, which were way up here, and averages were way down here, and kind of using our, you know, kind of guessing to get sort of where we don't want it to peak and clip, but we want the average to stay high. And So LUFS has answered a lot of those a lot of those problems. Um, and it's kind of become a standard. So now, like, in fact, if you Google and go, uh, what's the LUFS standard for YouTube? There's a number. What's the LUFS standard for, Facebook Live? There's a number. And in most cases, if you deliver to them a signal that's significantly higher or lower than their standard, they're just going to move it through their processing to that standard anyway, because that's their standard loudness curve. But the thing that I do, again, this is just a general thing. If you're dealing with web streaming, this is just another LUFS related thing. What I concentrate more on than anything else is, what am I putting into the system and what's coming out of the system? So I use Ulene loudness meters, which is a easy to find. I'm probably saying the name wrong because that's actually his name, but it looks like it's Youlean. So it looks like Ulene, but it's actually the developer's name, and I think it's Scandinavian or something. I'm butchering this. Sorry, Mr. Ulene. But anyway, great loudness meter tool that you can get online for a variety of different platforms. And the thing that it does that I really like is that it shows loudness over time. Mm-hmm. So it actually gives you a time scale, again, with kind of peaks and valleys. So what I do is I set up one instance of Ulene in the embedded video signal leaving wherever the origination place is, studio, whatever. And then I have a computer that's watching that stream on the other end.
Gotcha.
On a YouTube stream or a Facebook live stream or whatever it's being delivered on. And I run another instance of Ulene, same exact settings, same exact everything, to see what's coming out. Mm-hmm. And in general, I do that on the same computer or put them side by side. One will be 45 seconds behind, but that time meter difference will show me, okay, I'm pushing in minus 15, it's coming out minus 18. I push in minus 12, it's still coming out minus 18. I push in minus 9, it's still coming. It's like they're going to, this is as high as it's going to get. So if I keep pushing this up, it's just pushing it into more YouTube compression, and it's not helping. It's just making it sound worse. And I know to back off. And it's like, I may as well send minus 18 because that's what's going to be, coming out. So again, it's a way to kind of keep your reference point, or the opposite could be true. I'm sending way lower and it's coming out here. Well, that means they're adding a bunch of gain after the fact, and that's probably raising my noise floor. So the closer I can get to what's actually coming out, the hopefully more consistent it will be. All of the streaming platforms use various compression voodoo that they won't tell you what it is. Yeah. So there's always going to be something that changes from what you put in to what you get out. But at least this gives you an idea of the relativity of the two things.
No, that's great. I mean, you need the tools to know what you're doing, right? So I think that's great advice to monitor on both sides. That's great. Alex asks, how do you approach your broadcast compression? Heavier individual compression, group compression, master limiting? That's
a great question. And the answer is yes. Because again, in trying to get to as narrow a dynamics window as possible, just slamming everything into a limiter just sounds terrible. And so, yeah, I basically do kind of exactly what the question asks. And that is, I'm doing multi-stages of compression. So at the input level, I'm compressing maybe gently, depending, but then some other inputs maybe not so gently if I can get away with it. So I'm kind of being input specific about how much I'm compressing an individual input. And then maybe I'm subgrouping those down to different groups. So maybe I've got microphones in one group and I've got, instruments or something different, or I've got handheld microphones and lavalier microphones or whatever. And then I compress those depending on the source. And then I've got an output stage that's going, say, to a streaming platform, and I've got another stage of compression that's set to, you know, compress what I need to for that output. I may have another output that's going to records, and maybe the records, I have more dynamic range and I can just leave that alone. And if somebody in post-production wants to compress it more, then that's up to them. But yeah, I definitely find that kind of doing things in stages, so that you're doing a little bit and then you do a little bit more and then you do a little bit more, and you're able to kind of gauge, like, you know, what you can really clamp down on, it still sounds fine, versus some things that, no, that sounds really artificial and weird, and you know, that's too much of on that particular input.
Yeah, for like a broadcast mix, do you use kind of like a mastering limiter sort of thing at the end to try to really kind of just brick wall it up?
Yeah, yeah. So you know, in the kind of roughest, you know, roundest terms, like my main output bus that's going to broadcast will have a compression stage, which may be fairly aggressive depending on the content that's going into it. That's basically just limiting some of that dynamic range. And then after that will be a limiter that's basically a brick wall that no matter what happens, you're never getting past this. Yeah. And if I've done my job right with kind of gain staging my compressors all the way through, I nearly never hit that limiter. Yeah. But I'm always really close. And that's the trick. It's like, I want to be close to it. You know, if I'm looking at my signal level versus the threshold of that limiter, if my signal level is consistently here with only occasionally touching that limiter, then I'm right in the ballpark. You know, if I'm hammering it constantly, again, the sound gets this squashed, limited, gross FM radio kind of sound that I don't want. Yeah. But if I'm way down here, then I'm giving up way too much headroom, and either YouTube, not to pick on them, on the other end is going to put it back in anyway, but not in a way that I want. Yeah. Or frankly, someone's going to switch to my live stream, and it's going to be quiet, and they're going to get really disinterested really fast, and then they're going to switch to something else. Yeah. And that's a lot of what we're fighting against, is just, I'm watching TikTok, this is really cool. Watching a YouTube video, this is really cool. Oh, there's a live thing. Oh, I can barely hear that. What else is on? And they've moved on.
Lots of stuff is on, you know, like there's no shortage of content, you know. All right, a couple of people asked about, you mentioned using auto mixers. I assume they're asking about if they're Dugan mixers or not. I think
I can use the D word since I use Yamaha consoles. So yeah, I basically have been a big fan of Dan Dugan for a long time, both personally and for his products. And I've been using Dan Dugan auto mixers since the late 80s, when they were analog and super expensive. I leverage Dugan auto mixing very heavily. It's one of the biggest reasons why I'm a big Yamaha console user, is because the Dugan auto mixing is built in. It is kind of magic sauce, and yes. So the answer is yes to all of the above. There are some other auto mixers other manufacturers make. Some of them are very similar, but you know, the original is kind of still the best.
Yeah, it kind of saves a lot of fader pushing, doesn't it? I mean,
yeah, well, and it really does things that are physically impossible.
It's so fast.
You know, it's so fast. And so, you know, the trick with using Dugan auto mixing is you set it to, you put a channel of each on each one of your microphones that are open, but you set it to post fader insert, not pre fader insert, which means that the relative levels of your faders as you're moving them changes the weighting of the Dugan auto mixing. So I like to explain it like this. What really ends up happening is that the Dugan accentuates your fader moves. So, because like if I've got 6 faders, picture, if you will, 6 faders in my fingers, and I've got a panel of 6 people talking, and if I just duck this one guy by like that much, that's unweighting that on the Dugan by that much, and therefore emphasizing the other 5 in, you know, or if I'm like, oh, one person's talking right now, so I'm going to boost them a slight bit, It's going to de-emphasize everybody else every single time that person talks.
Right.
So as soon as they say a word, it's going to duck everybody else. Excuse me. And then, but if someone interrupts and suddenly says something, their fader's still up and you'll catch every word and you can still hear it. It reacts at a speed that you could not possibly react to in real time. It's kind of magic, but you still have to mix. And that's the thing, is a lot of people think, oh, it's an auto mixer, so I can just put everything, 6 channels, I put them all up to unity and the Dugan will just mix it. And it's like, no, for maximum clarity, you still need to, this person's kind of talking, I'm going to give them a little boost. And, this person's not talking, I'm going to take them down a little bit because, they might like scratch or, rustle a paper or something. And I don't want to hear that. And, so it's, you still have to actively mix, but it so accentuates what you're doing and in an organic way that it's pretty much a tool I can't live without.
No, that's great. Yeah, it's totally saved me on a couple gigs. I don't know how I would have got through them. Honestly, it would have been bad, and like really the only thing that saved me was having to do.
I did not to bore anybody with a long story. I'll make a very quick version of it. But I was in a large convention center in DC for a large trade organization. I can't even remember which one it was, but the setup was there were these long tables on this ginormous stage, and everybody on stage had a 58 on a desk stand in front of them. All the mics had to be on all the time because anybody could comment at any time. There were 40 of them. So it was 40 SM58s wide open on a stage with a PA to cover like 15,000 people. You can't do that without an auto mixer. Like there's no way you can get enough gain before feedback with 40 open SM58s and a PA for that many people. Like it's, and this was literally back when I had a stack of 5 Dugans all stacked up to do the thing. And then it was totally possible and totally fine. And I had a PM4000 just mixing table mics with just auto mixing in it. And that's all it was doing, sub-mixed into my other console to do everything else. It was the only possible way to do the job.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, problem solving with the corporate gigs, right? You got to figure out how to make it work.
Absolutely.
Here's a question from Angelo. Are you ever juggling live broadcasts and I think front of house and broadcast at the same time? I think that's what he's asking. I know it's a point of conversation, especially going forward with a lot of, front of house mixers, or like, are you expected to handle both? Or, we could talk about how to handle both at the same time at a different webinar, but should people be pushing back on having to handle both, or I don't know.
The short answer to should people be pushing back on is if you can. The reality is, no matter how good you are, nobody can do 2 different jobs as well at the same time as they can do one job as well at the same time. There are some situations where, okay, the live event is for 20,000 people and we're also streaming for 10 guys in Minnesota. Well, okay. Like, all right, if I make a slight mistake and the broadcast mix isn't quite perfect for the 10 guys in Minnesota, probably not worth getting a separate broadcast console for that application. Or it may be just the opposite. We've got, 50 people in this room, but we're webcasting to the entire company, and that's, 15,000 people worldwide. Mm-hmm. Okay, so you can hear it in the room. And I've been in both of these kinds of situations. Like these are not really made up scenarios. Like this kind of thing happens where it's like, okay, so the rooms that, everybody can kind of hear in the room, and that's great. But my primary focus is I've got the headphones on and I'm listening to the broadcast mix because that's where most of the audience is. But when you get a situation where it's like, no, both of them are critically important. It's like, well, as long as you think half of my skills is enough to mix for each one, then okay. But it's just, there are certain things that are different for each one. I mean, at the most basic level, if you have a live audience and you're producing a broadcast mix, the broadcast mix has to have ambient microphones in it so that people know that there's a live audience there. That's a source that's not in the live PA, but is only in the broadcast. And the mix between that and the broadcast level is critical for it to not sound weird.
Yeah.
And if I'm trying to hit cues in the room and trying to make the room sound good, but also trying to put ambient mics in a mix that I also have to listen to with headphones while I'm listening to the room, you see where this very quickly becomes a compromise.
Yeah.
So, I think that more and more in the future, we're going to be placed in positions where we're asked to do this. And I think we're going to do the best we can, but I do think it's a compromise. It's a compromise.
Sure. And but I think learning how to explain the difference, I think is good. So I think a lot of what you've been saying, I think is really pertinent. I mean, yeah, I think if you can explain to someone why you wouldn't want to do both, I think that's a good way to make that not happen. Or, and the thing,
yeah, well, and the thing that I said early on, and this is just something that's kind of occurred to me literally like in the last year or so, is that there is just a difference perception wise between sitting in a live audience and listening to an event. I expect a completely different dynamic range. I expect the talking head, I expect the videos to take my head off because I want them to be like, I'm talking about corporate events. Like, I'm not even talking about anything like, yeah, I want the big, huge video. And then the guy will come out and talk in a normal voice. Well, in the broadcast, those two things have to be the same volume. That's completely different. Like it's on the most basic level, this is a completely different thing that you're being asked to create simultaneously. That's very challenging to get right. It's very hard to listen to this thing and get it perfectly and listen to this thing and get it perfectly all at the same time.
Yeah. All right, we'll take one more question. I think we're out of time, guys. But from Alex, do you have any tips and tricks for building compression chains?
Well, again, giant lake, skimming the surface. I tend to start light. So it's like 2.5, 3-to-1 compression ratios, relatively high thresholds, kind of, trying not to kill it in the initial stage. And then the next one may be a little bit higher ratio, might be a little bit higher threshold. It might be a little bit more aggressive. The next stage might be a little more aggressive. And the final stage is like infinity to 1, set to this threshold. Thou shalt not go past this. It will not happen. I don't care what you do. And that's kind of a general rule of thumb. Everything in audio is a general rule of thumb. There's always, going to be some exceptions, but that's kind of a general rule of thumb.
Totally. That's great. Great advice. Well, Brian, thanks for coming on again. This has been amazing. Great talk. I know we barely got into some of this stuff. We covered a ton of very, in-depth topics just on the surface, but we'll come back and talk about some more stuff, maybe in another video at another point.
I'd be happy to do it. I enjoyed it quite a lot. And thanks to those who hung around long enough to listen to me yak for an hour.
And anyone, if you have questions, comments, anything specific, just email me, scott@theproductionacademy.com, and we'll get your questions answered. So, all right. Bye everybody. And we'll be talking to you soon. All right. See ya.